evening. I'm Sam Connell. I am one of the librarians here at New Canaan Library, and we are so delighted to have you join us here this evening for Women of the Civil War, a lecture by historian and professor Catherine Clinton, and she will discuss the wide range of roles that women took on during the Civil War. Tonight's program supports the library's 14th Annual Literary Luncheon Benefit, which is coming up this November 4th. And without any further ado, I would like to introduce our guest speaker. Catherine Clinton holds the Denman Chair of American History at the University of Texas in San Antonio and is Professor Emerita at Queen's University, Belfast. She has served on the Executive Council of the Society of American Historians and on the Advisory Committee of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Bicentennial Commission. And she remains on advisory boards for Civil War History, Civil War Times, the President's Cottage and Soldiers Home, and Ford's Theater. Ms. Clinton has written and edited over 30 books, including children's fiction, booklets for the National Park Service, and poetry anthologies. Her first book, The Plantation Mistress, Woman's World in the Old South, appeared in 1982 and was a selection of the History Book Club. Her 2004 biography of Harriet Tubman, The Road to Freedom, was named as one of the best nonfiction books by the Christian Science Monitor and the Chicago Tribune. Mrs. Lincoln, A Life, was published by HarperCollins in 2009, and Ms. Clinton subsequently served as a consultant for Steven Spielberg's 2012 film, Lincoln. You may have heard of it. Anyway, she was awarded the Guggenheim Fellowship in the U.S. History and also in 2016. We wanted to let you know we have many copies of these books here at New Canaan Library. Feel free to stop by or go to newcanaanlibrary.org and you can place one of these wonderful books on hold. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Professor Clinton.
Thank you, Steph, and thank you, New Canaan Library, for giving me an opportunity to visit a place that I knew well. I spent a lot of my career raising my children in Greenwich, Connecticut, and writing some of these 30 books. And so I'm very familiar with the wonderful libraries and the area as well. And it's also nice for me to get to revisit the topic of women and the Civil War in such an important historic time. The American Civil War proved transformative for American women. The destruction of slavery and emancipation through the 13th Amendment remained the war's most significant permanent impact on a key block of females, those previously enslaved. The demographic impact of the loss of hundreds of thousands of men changed both families and the shape and direction of women's lives following surrender and peace. During the war, the assumption of male roles and the expansion of the portfolio of politically acceptable duties was enormous, as women joined the nursing corps, developed skills on the home front, produced goods for soldiers while keeping the home fires burning. Many took on responsibilities within communities and even their government to take the place of men away at war. Scores of women were involved in espionage as fellow travelers and spies, and wartime necessity even found a few women cross-dressing and serving as soldiers. As women in the North rallied for victory, many across the Union states joined the Sanitary Commission as the significance of their roles increased with each passing year. Matters of health became as key to keeping troops in the field as much as the draft. Women in the South found supplying the Army nearly crippled rural communities. The failure of the government to meet the soldiers' wives' demands meant women's enthusiasm for the rebel cause diminished over time. Keeping plantations running with dislocations and invasions proved challenging to plantation mistresses. Poor white women's resentment of government demands deepened with each passing of planting seasons and harvests. After nearly 750,000 soldiers had perished, the surrender of the Confederacy to the revitalized Union created an opportunity for dramatic changes. although the restructuring and redistributing that followed the war concentrated on issues of race rather than gender. Nevertheless, the gains made by American women with widespread and prolonged commitment to soldier relief, charity, and women's organizations led to the strengthening of female reform following the Civil War. Further, women, mainly in the North and the Midwest, renewed their campaigns for the vote. Most strikingly in the South, women became champions of memorialization and channeled considerable time and energy into keeping memories of their wartime sacrifice and lost causes in the forefront of the American imagination. The more than 700,000 military deaths, and for nearly 150 years, we estimated the death rate at 620, but estimates upwards to 720 to 750,000 has been a revelation in the 2010s. And the countless number of collateral damages, particularly among the vulnerable African American community, made an incalculable impact on American families. So these events placed enormous burdens on American women trying to recover from the loss of fathers, brothers, and sons. The demographic fallout was considerable, but socio-political change hit with gale force, and the reconfiguration of the federal project, the national economy, and particularly the redefinition of citizenship shook this country to its foundations. The United States was clearly a shotgun marriage with sectional differences papered over to make a fortuitous union. There had been dramatic developments in the decades leading up to the war. By 1860, 14 states had reformed laws dealing with the Married Women's Property Act. Regardless of the variety of reasons why these reforms were enacted, antebellum women exploited concessions for their own ends. In many cases, legislative remedy bore little relation to feminist demands. In addition, the guarantee of property was a very bourgeois concern of a female elite. Feminist organizations did battle for the right of women to keep their own wages. By mid-century, both broad-based concerns and elitist considerations were promoted. In northern states, women's network banded together to support a strong abolitionist coalition of Quakers, evangelicals, and reform-minded women. Women radicals transformed the fight against slavery into a battle to improve their own status, and by 1850 began to convene annually to promote women's rights. As a group declared in 1851, "We deny the right of any portion of the species to decide for another portion that the proper sphere for all human beings is the largest and highest to which they are able to attain." Women such as Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, Abby Kelly Foster, Paulina Wright Davis, Antoinette Brown, Elizabeth Oakes Smith, Sojourner Truth, and Ernestine Rose spearheaded movements to advance a wide range of causes. I hope in the year after the 100th celebration of the passage of the suffrage amendment, some of these names are a bit more familiar. But we know that these women were not just content to go for the vote. They were pushing for temperance, access to higher education, dress reform, abolitionism, in addition to votes for women. Most of these women were born in the North, but two, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, were born into a slave-holding family in South Carolina, but they moved north to Philadelphia. They converted to the Society of Friends, exiling themselves from the South to become outspoken champions of anti-slavery and women's rights. South Carolina's Declaration of Secession in December 1860 and the formation of the Confederacy in the early months of 1861 appear inevitable only in retrospect. But as women and men rallied to their separate causes, the long secession winter developed into a springtime with a call to arms, accompanying news of the formation of the Confederate States of America. Women, North and South, Black and white, slave and free, were in turn shocked, thrilled, and alarmed by such events. Women mobilized on behalf of the war effort, North and South, with ladies' relief societies directing their energies to the care, feeding, and nursing of soldiers. Many women, seizing opportunities or driven by desperate circumstances, turned to the booming sex trade during wartime. Wartime was the period during which the number of prostitutes grew generally, but during the American Civil War, this population skyrocketed. Indeed, the war may have been the single most significant boom to the sex trade in American history, and without question, the cause of a dramatic spike for the 19th century. The response to this phenomenon was complex and diverse. Attempts to regulate prostitution by the medical wing of the Federal Army failed miserably. Attempts to deport prostitutes from war zones by Union officials failed as well. Finally, debates over the topic of prostitutes, which focused on subsequent disease among the troops, were few and far between. Most discussions of the sex trade never tackled the subject in any clear, direct manner, leaving interpretation to linger between the lines. When Lincoln issued his call to arms, it was easy for the federal government to draw on middle-class women's talents and experience on behalf of war relief. In April 1861, over 3,000 New Yorkers turned out at Cooper Union to rally to the Northern cause. Out of this massive response, the New York Central Association of Relief was founded, with 12 women on the 25-member board. This group, in addition to collecting and distributing supplies, trained nurses for work in hospitals and on the battlefield. The New York group was one of 7,000 local societies in the Union, which constituted the United States Sanitary Commission, the most effective and important institution developed by women during the war. Judith Giesberg's scholarship on this topic demonstrates that local activism on women's part created the establishment of later organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union and made females the fundamental part of a transitional political culture, which included labor and moral reform movements alongside feminist agitation. Supplies worth millions of dollars were doled out to the needy soldiers, widows, and orphans. Women used many of the innovations developed during their anti-slavery campaigns, such as fairs and bazaars to raise funds. In 1863, the Northwest branch of the Sanitary Commission sponsored a 2-week fundraising fair in Chicago, which netted over $100,000. Not to be outdone, Boston, St. Louis, New York, and other cities followed suit. In Washington, D.C., when the Lincolns attended a Shakespearean performance on October 17, 1863, where Charlotte Cushman played Lady Macbeth, the theatrical benefit netted the Sanitary Commission over $2,000. These examples demonstrate how women expanded their peacetime charitable organizations into an important arm of wartime activism to fund and sustain the Union cause. In June 1861, Dorothea Dix was appointed superintendent of nurses for the Union Army. She set up strict regulations for the training of women, establishing a minimum age of 30 for her corps of volunteers. Her stipulation that nurses be plain in appearance drew considerable criticism from prettier applicants and male patients. Dix and other women pioneers in medicine were aware of the prejudice many men harbored against unmarried women participating in immodest activities. She wanted to ensure that her nurses would be above reproach. But as the war dragged on, the 40 cents per day wage plus subsistence and transport appealed to many more than just widows or married women with husbands away at war. Many women did not merely want to make themselves useful, but also needed the income. Younger women might sign on to nurse for other reasons. Some, deprived of social activities as well as beaux, wanted to serve personal and patriotic needs by nursing. Many wartime romances blossomed in hospital wards. Nurses not only cared for soldiers in wards, but some earned praise for their tours of battlefields. Marianne Bickerdike, an accomplished nurse, spent most of her time at the Union's military hospital in Cairo, Illinois. But Mother Bickerdike, as she was affectionately known to the troops, attended to wounded on 19 battle sites. The efficient Quaker woman was a welcome sight to the fallen soldier. Even more inventive, nurses and matrons were invited by the War Department to join floating hospitals, warships near the battle sites, tasked to rescue wounded soldiers. The Sanitary Commission equipped hospital ships, and one nurse described her experience aboard the Daniel Webster. We four are the only women on board, except a colored chambermaid. It is an old steamship, now wretchedly dirty. Excuse me. Clara Barton was perhaps the best known nurse of the Civil War, later a founder of the American Red Cross. She worked independently of the Federal Army, organizing in the state of Massachusetts. Through her personal appeals, thousands of dollars were raised for food and medicine for soldiers. She extended her campaign beyond New England, becoming an advocate for women's wartime service. Women had broken into the medical profession as doctors before 1861, but female doctors made minor inroads, battling outsider status during the war. Sorry, I'm having a bit of a trial with dry throat. Today was a teaching day. There were women who were trying to break into the Army. Elizabeth Blackwell had earned a medical degree. She opened a practice in New York, yet they were crippled by prejudice. The one woman doctor whose persistence paid off was Mary Walker, who applied for a post with the Army as soon as war broke out. She was a figure whose cross-dressing threatened not only the medical establishment, but the military as well. The Union refused to grant her a commission for 3 years. But in 1864, her application was approved. She was sent to the front to Chattanooga, Tennessee. Shortly thereafter, she became a prisoner of war. After being exchanged for a Confederate physician, Walker went on to supervise the female military prison in Louisville, Kentucky. She was honorably discharged and later recognized for her service by President Andrew Johnson, indeed the first woman to earn the Medal of Honor. War, explained the narrator of Gone with the Wind, is men's business, not ladies. When women became nurses and fundraisers and patriotic lifelines, they self-consciously took on new roles. Indeed, so remarkable was women's participation in this conflict that one British journalist countered with the following sentiment: no war in history had ever seemed so much a woman's war as the Civil War. And I'm pleased to report that this year, in 2021, Thelvolia Glimp, a friend and scholar, has won major book prizes from half a dozen organizations for her new study, The Women's Fight, the Civil War's battles for home, freedom, and nation. In many ways, she's trying to replace some of the mythology about women in the war promoted by several generations of celebrants of the lost cause, men and women who promoted the valor and glory of Confederate patriotism. The white women became mythic and exalted creatures within Confederate discourse. Newspapers drew out her role and dissected her significance. In Southern periodicals, young ladies refused engagements to men who failed to enlist, and Northern papers commented on what appeared to be indecent zeal, rebel spitfires, as they were often called. In her study, Mothers of Invention, Women of the Slaveholding South, Drew Faust has suggested women's waning support for the war may have led to the demise of the Confederate project. Those left behind to manage with such scarce resources, crumbling communities, depleted energies. With such a large percentage of eligible Southern men serving in the military, with estimates of as high as 3 out of 4 eligible white males, females in the South were thrown back on their own resources. Prior to the war, elite women could lead protected lives in the bubble of the private sphere. Many women felt betrayed when male leadership did not fulfill its part of the bargain. Scholar Stephanie Murray concurs that the Confederate government was forced to allow the unfranchised to voice their dissent. Thus, government assistance became a clarion cry for soldiers' wives, invoking what Mcclure calls a politics of subsistence. Women did not see themselves as seeking charity, but rather framed their claims against the state as a right. Elite Southern white women struggled to be ladylike, even when subject to enemy occupation. Women drawn into the conflict believed it was their patriotic duty to uphold proper gender etiquette. Still, many women drawn into war inevitably defied 19th century norms, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Confederates seem even more concerned with the impropriety of ladies ministering to men outside their families, to strangers who might even be ruffians. This may have been especially true for women of the planter class who pushed their way into these roles, as wartime exigency demanded a loosening of the rigid boundaries, particularly for women who allegedly perched on pedestals prior to the war. Despite opposition, white Southern women mobilized on behalf of white Confederate soldiers. Besides the traditional roles of knitting, sewing, rolling bandages, Confederate women rose to the occasion. One exemplary Southern matron, Juliet Hopkins, wife of a former Alabama senator and state Supreme Court justice, donated the proceeds from selling off lands in New York and Virginia to establish hospitals for wounded soldiers. Hopkins went to Richmond in June 1861 to try to coordinate efforts. Back in Alabama, she founded a hospital for Confederate soldiers, and the state legislature appointed her matron of all the state's hospitals. She also organized women in groups to produce and collect necessary supplies. By 1862, Alabama boasted 90 women's auxiliaries. But Hopkins' activities were not limited to managerial role, and in July 1862, during the Battle of Seven Pines, she was trying to retrieve wounded Confederate soldiers from the field and was shot in the leg. Following her surgery, Hopkins returned to her medical work, but suffered a limp for the rest of her life. Sally Tompkins, daughter of an aristocratic Richmond family, borrowed the house of a neighbor to create a 22-bed clinic after the Battle of Bull Run in the summer of '61. For her exemplary service, Confederate President Jefferson Davis accorded her the rank of captain in the Confederate Army, and the energetic spinster's enterprise mushroomed during the years ahead. By war's end, Tompkins had treated almost 1,300 men with only 73 deaths. Her dedication to the war effort paved the way for other elite women to serve. Another spirited Southern woman argued, a woman's respectability must be at a low ebb if it can be endangered by going into a hospital. Former Charleston socialite Phoebe Pember, hard at work as a Confederate hospital matron in Richmond, complained of rats who ate all the poultices applied during the night to the sick and dragged away the pads stuffed with bran from under the arms and the legs of the wounded. Pember faced even thornier problems when the wife of one of her patients overstayed her welcome, giving birth to a daughter on her husband's cot, given the name Phoebe by grateful parents. Some Southern ladies even brought along enslaved men and women with them in the hospital as assistants and protectors. Women doctors were even rarer in the South. Little is known of the Southern pioneer Louisa Shepherd, who completed her training in 1861 at the Grafenberg Medical Institute in Dadeville, Alabama. Physician Elizabeth Cohen of New Orleans limited her practice to ladies only. Women doctors were a threat to the image of Southern ladyhood and the Confederate medical establishment. Many, if not most, ladies were trained by necessity to minister to patients isolated on farms and estates in the rural South. These medical practices were informal, widely praised. Only when women attempted to professionalize their standing to obtain institutional affiliation did men discourage women's cultivation of medical skills. Some women who started with the Army as nurses soon shifted into more daring roles as scouts and spies. The famed Belle Boyd joined the Confederate Army as a nurse while still a teenager in the home she shared with her parents in Martinsburg, Virginia. Her prowess on horseback brought her more challenging work as she became a celebrated heroine for her secret missions in the Valley of Virginia. Boyd once rode 30 miles in a single night to reveal plans of a Union attack. When she was betrayed and arrested in July 1862, Northern press painted her as, quote, a village courtesan, intimating that information could only be obtained by resorting to immoral sexual conduct. During the early days of the war, overconfident soldiers on both sides quite clearly became careless with military information, more likely at the bar than in the bed. Women viewed as passive observers could obtain military information with the greater ease than men and found it less dangerous passing on this data. Mary Chestnut, writing behind Confederate lines near Richmond, confided to her diary that women quite easily tucked letters in garments or in their hair so that they could transport documents without fear of being searched. Southern Society hostess Rose O'Neill Greenough was placed under house arrest in Washington, D.C. in August 1861. During the first week of her confinement, she was forced to sleep with her door open while sentinels kept watch. Greenough and other suspects held in her home, which became known as Fort Greenough, were kept from all but their immediate families. These imprisoned women had their mail censored. They were denied newspapers. Soon, prostitutes suspected of espionage were housed together with Greenough and her society friends. Confederates claimed the widow and her 8-year-old daughter were subjected to undue humiliation, particularly when they were transferred, mother and daughter, to the old Capitol prison. A public campaign pressured her release, and Greenough left Washington for a triumphant parade and greeting in the Confederate capital of Richmond. She ran the blockade, traveled to Europe, making diplomatic visits on behalf of the Confederacy. While sailing home in October 1864, weighed down with gold sewn in her hem and documents in her pouch, Greenough tried to evade Union patrol boats. She drowned not far from the North Carolina shore where she was trying to reach. In a rare gesture of acknowledgement, she was given a hero's burial. Those women who trespassed gender boundaries were rare within the Confederacy, but one, Loretta Janetta Velazquez, not only disguised herself as a male to serve as a soldier, but she trespassed in several different ways. Elizabeth Leonard explains that Velazquez was extremely subversive, not just a woman soldier, but she was an Hispanic woman in White Brothers' War. Velazquez had many different motives for cross-dressing to join the army, but clearly her actions involved personal ambition. Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, was my favorite heroine, an example of what a woman may do if she only dares and dares to do greatly. She laid out her life story in a sprawling epic, a memoir, A Woman in Battle, published in 1876. She never received any patriotic commendation for her contribution. She was attacked by former Confederate General Jubal Early, who denied her identity and suggested she might have been a prostitute during the war. Within the Confederacy and in the border states, the majority of white women experienced features of war unknown to most Union women, further from frontline combat. Although many families were deprived of food and luxury items, mainly Southern households were disrupted by invasion and occupation. Within the contested Confederate territories, the boundary between home front and battlefront blurred as women found themselves caught up directly in military struggle, trapped behind enemy lines, women of the occupied South. And indeed, a lot of new scholarship calls the American Civil War the household war. Gradually, the Union Army invaded and held significant portions of Confederate territory. The war could turn the power relations upside down on the home front. Kate Mcclure, a plantation mistress left behind in Union County, South Carolina during the war, banned Mayberry, the overseer hired by her husband, from entering her household. Instead, she deputized a Black man and enslaved Jeff and admitted him into her home. She trusted the African Americans left behind on the plantation more than the white man designated to be in charge. Her resistance to the overseer's authority, particularly following her discovery of his coercive sexual relationship with enslaved women, forced Mayberry to abandon his post. Alliances between mistresses and slaves were rarely documented, and only a few pieces of evidence have trickled through. More commonly, the Volya glimpse suggested relationships between mistresses and slaves fostered abuse and were maintained through coercive physical force. The emancipation of enslaved people was unquestionably the single most significant event in African Americans' wartime experience, if not generally within US history. This dramatic shift in legal status for the majority of women of African descent on the American continent, a shift precipitated by war and followed by crises that continued through much of the century. Although most ex-slaves were given nothing but freedom, and although African American women knew freedom had different meanings for men and women, this momentous occasion had a permanent impact on the future of Black women in America. Throughout the antebellum period, the majority of African American women lived in the rural South and were held in bondage. The majority of women in bondage grew up on plantations, estates where 20 or more enslaved people would provide status and wealth for whites within the rural South. The Volya Glimp has persuasively demonstrated how the plantation household was a political sphere where enslaved women and white women battled over labor, kin, and autonomy. Their clashes have been chronicled in diaries and letters. The battle between freedom and citizenship. These bloody battlegrounds emerged during the period immediately following the Civil War. Glimp's study built on the suggestion that plantation mistresses represented the feminine face of paternalism, an idea developed by Elizabeth Fox Genovese. Glimp persuasively suggests violence and politics were far from removed from the private sphere. Rather, the cauldron of contradictions often boiled over in this atmosphere with explosive results. She argues that most white slaveholding women were actively involved in their bondspeople's lives, so much so that white women could and did violently coerce enslaved workers, exacting punishment for insubordination, for example. Drew Faust's notion that white women only gained mastery with wartime experiences does not fit neatly with Glimp's structured analysis, but each has her own agenda for drawing attention to power dynamics and shifts during wartime. The experience of African American women during the war continues an underexplored topic, but inroads are being made as scholars focus on this significant issue, and intersecting scholarship sheds new light on women in resistance, women in contraband camps, Black women nurses, and other neglected topics. Memoirs of African American women are rare, but important testimony. The journals of Charlotte Fortin and Brenda Stevenson's superb analysis of Fortin allows us a window into the extraordinary experiences of one Black woman who went south during the war to conduct what W.E.B. Du Bois lauded as the 10th Crusade. She was part of a vanguard of pioneering women at the forefront of this movement to turn occupation into a permanent revolution within the Confederacy. Fortin dedicated herself to her young pupils, and she talked to the children, as she says, a little while today, about the noble Toussaint Louverture. They listened very attentively. It is well they should know about one of their own color, what he could do for their race. I long to inspire them with courage and ambition. Fortin's touching description of her first Thanksgiving in the Sea Islands, with that crowd of eager, happy Black faces from which the shadow of slavery has forever passed, forever free, forever free. Again, recounting festivities on January the 1st, 1863 is equally poignant, with the assembled free people spontaneously singing, "My Country 'Tis of Thee." Colonel Thomas Higginson misting up during the ceremony and the reading of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. So Fortin was a witness to the new birth of freedom for these ex-slaves. She wanted to ensure both that freedom was permanent and that society continued its commitment to uplift for her brethren. Fortin was empathetic to her charges, even if she found them, quote, backward, as her education and class dictated. Fortin had a significant literary mission to show her readers that these emancipated Blacks were deserving of the freedom they had been given, to show them as worthy of the investment she and others were making to raise them into their rightful role as citizens. The centrality of slavery and the fate of African Americans seems so very apparent to us now, but this issue was not so simple for most white Americans in the 1860s. Indeed, African Americans felt compelled to speak out on this issue, to be heard. The story of one remarkable woman, Frances Rollin, and her literary efforts can tell us much about this neglected dimension. Rollin was born in a small but significant community of free Blacks. And these people were dedicated to the proposition that they could, in some way, transform the South. Indeed, we even find a woman like Susie King Taylor, who was a Black nurse attached to South Carolina troops, the only Black Southern women to serve with Union troops and leave us a record. Her Reminiscences of My Life in Camp is an invaluable memoir, the voice of one exemplary African-American woman's Civil War. Her insights into her experience in rural Georgia, Savannah, the Seal Islands, moving from slavery to freedom. And she published her story in 1902 to give us some idea. Now, it's much more difficult to extract the voices of ordinary Black women, but the recently compiled multi-volume Freedom, a documentary history of emancipation, 1861 to 1867, which was published between 1985 and 2013, offers a dramatic range of African-American women's voices from the period, an extraordinary opportunity for future researchers. And on that note, I will close and maybe take some of your questions. Thank you for your attention. Maybe Steph can reappear and do a translation of what you've put into the chat.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, I'm having some audio issues on my end, but let me start us off with the first question. So I'm unable to camera on at the moment. Can you hear me, Professor Clinton?
I can hear you.
Terrific. Okay.
I hope the rest
So
of it.
our first question is that one of our attendees has heard reference in Civil War accounts that soldiers significantly wounded in the war, for example, amputation or part or all of their leg, found it difficult to marry post-war because they were thought less able to earn income as farmers or jobs requiring physical labor. Did this happen? And if so, is there any information that you can share with our audience, or is there no reliable information about that?
Well, I think this is part of the new history of disability that is being really promoted in our field. And it's a very exciting time because we are looking into what the health and mentality of soldiers were. I myself happen to be working on a large study on mental health of soldiers, those that were diagnosed as insane. But we do know that the cost psychologically of amputations was very high. We also know, remember I talked about women's campaigns, and therefore there was a massive effort in North and South to give privilege, to give place, to give a heroic welcome to those men who were disabled, those men who did lose limbs. And we have really great work on this. I'm fogging right now, but my good friend Brian, whose name I'm forgetting, I need to have my my computer turned on, but unfortunately I'm Zooming with you. But I can also say that Susan Mary Grant is a UK scholar of the Civil War, and she has also written about what the psychological toll was on soldiers who did lose their limbs. And we can look at the post-war situation in, for example, the state of Alabama, and it's sticking in my mind that something like 1/5 to 1/4 of the state budget of Alabama in the Reconstruction period went to providing prosthetic limbs for former soldiers, because there was a federal system of pension and care for Union soldiers, but Confederate soldiers could only look to their states for this kind of benefit. But in terms of how men were treated on this score, I know that both Alice Foss, who's a scholar of literature about and during the Civil War, has written about romances and other issues, as has Nina Silver, who is a co-editor of mine on 2 volumes, but she has also written about the romance of reunion and what the kind of ideology was about the girls and soldiers. So you can look up both Nina Silver, Susan Mary Grant, and Alice Foss, and perhaps find some representations of what were the relationships between women and disabled soldiers in the post-war period.
Thank you so much for that. We have another question about your book. Stepdaughters of History. We have that book in our collection. And if you could talk to us a little bit about some of the damaging tropes and how that affects us even today.
Yes, well, I did include, for example, in my very last chapter, a chapter called Mammy by Any Other Name. Why? Because I think it's really quite striking that the image of the mammy, the persistence of the mammy is still very much with us. She was under attack during the Black Lives Matter movement, which is ongoing, so that we could, in a way, dismantle this image. And dismantling the mammy is something I think in both film and in popular culture is a very important ongoing battle. I also was trying to feature the fact that those women who had endured much privation and were trying to re-embrace the returning soldiers from the Confederate battlefield were put in a terrible dilemma. There were maimed, there were psychologically depleted, there was economic ruin for the white slaveholding class because their quote property had been dispossessed, and they now found themselves without status under the boot heel, as they felt, of Union occupation, which was in many ways simply federal government reestablishing a union. And that created enormous tension during this period. What was women's role in it? I argue that they took up their pens. They also took up their fundraising in the 13 former Confederate states, and they wanted to present a united front of valor and a united front that they would overcome the defeat, that the next generation would honor and revere its ancestors, much as those in the North were revering theirs. So Stepdaughters of History is very much treating that. In the middle chapter, I talk about impermissible patriots and the way in which we look at women should rise to the occasion, but the moment women would rise to the occasion, as I mentioned several times in my lecture, women would be immediately having their motives called into question. If you were a rebel spy passing along information, you were a loose woman, you were perhaps a courtesan, and this kind of attack on the moral character of, quote, patriotic women was seen as severe denigration. When I did a book many years ago called Tara Revisited, I was so surprised when I went on my book tour and found that at every place I went, I was asked repeatedly about the prostitutes who followed the army, the way in which white Southern women were reduced to the sex trade. And indeed, this is something that I began to write about and think about and include an essay in one of my other books called Battle Scars, where I look at this question of if women are being patriotic, then how can we turn it around and discard their loyalty and instead shroud it in sexual immorality, which was a very common charge. And this is why I think during the post-war period, there was this elevation of women's patriotism through the United Daughters of the Confederacy, through the memorial movements that went on. And women were trying to overcome the trope that they had been camp followers during the war. That's one trope that was overcome.
Thank you so much. So we have another question. So this program tonight is part of our support and tie-in to our literary luncheon, which is a huge benefit we have once a year. And this year, the book that was selected is Sunflower Sisters by Martha Kelly. I'm not sure if you read it, but if you could comment for our attendees about if you read any fiction from this era, if you find accuracy or any sort of problems with the depiction of this era that steps away from the history of what happened.
Well, I have to say, over the past 25, 30 years, there's been a really, I think, enormous awakening of the interest in the Civil War. And I can look and see the way in which I think a book like Cold Mountain, which of course I've read and reviewed and commented on, the other book on Verena that is by that wonderful author is something that I also read. Pauline Giles has written a lot of fiction that I appreciate. I will say that I think there's a problem with mythology, that so much of the literature of the war follows quite a mythological trope, that we look and we see that all the women were Spitfires and they were resisting, quote, damn Yankees. And yet we can look and see that there are great tales of reconciliation in the post-war period. Even the young Winnie Davis, the, quote, daughter of the Confederacy, fell in love with the grandson of an abolitionist, and her family intervened, and she was then thrown out. So I look at the novels and biographies of these people. I have a problem that as an historian still writing in the field, I'm trying to keep myself very clued in to wonderful details that I can pick up in the archives. And if you read too many fictional tales, you tend to get them jumbled inside. So I'm afraid, quite limited in my fiction reading. And I look forward to a period of retirement when I can think more about reading fiction and perhaps even writing fiction. Although I have to say, in my early career, when I introduced some of my historical colleagues to what I thought were some of the feminist, subversive ideas that women were promoting in the 19th century, they accused me of fiction writing, but I hope to return to it. I did a biography of a wonderful woman named Fanny Kimball, who was a playwright and a diarist. She wrote 11 volumes of memoir, and she wrote her first novel at 80. So I'm thinking, hey, maybe I can retire from this history game and get on to fiction.
Oh, that would be wonderful. So we have time for maybe 2 more questions. We did want to ask you, your career as a teacher, a lecturer, as a historian, as an author is so diverse and fascinating. What advice do you have? We have a lot of families here with us tonight. What advice do you have to the parents who have children who are interested in history and who want to pursue history as an area of study?
Well, I run a funded master's program down here in San Antonio, the University of Texas in San Antonio. We have a wonderful program, and I say you can never start too young introducing your children to history. I do have to say, taking my 4-year-old to the 125th Gettysburg celebration was very traumatizing for him as he tried to walk across a field that was laced with fake explosives, but nonetheless dangerous. But I did drag my children off to many places. And in Terra Revisited, in the newest book, Stepdaughters of History, in my introduction, I tell the story that my father took me to Civil War centenary, and I was never interested in it. And yet it did plant a seed that you could be in a place, you could touch history. Every year I return to Gettysburg for the Lincoln Forum, where we celebrate scholarship on Lincoln, and we have a recreation of his Gettysburg Address. So I believe that the national parks and the way in which the multiple levels of historical markers, and really the new statue of Mary McLeod Bethune that's going to be installed in the Capitol, means that history is all around us. History is a wonderful, exciting thing. The skills you learn in history are to take a diverse body of information, weave it together, learn to articulate, learn to write skillfully, learn to get your ideas across. And it doesn't mean that you'll become a historian or even a teacher, but that you'll be able to take in the information that is hitting us so fast. And the one thing I know you librarians know, that we all know, is that we are bombarded with information. And yet it is so important for us to develop a sense of knowledge. And therefore, as an educator, I continue to try and work in the public arena. I have written several children's books. I do work on public history as much as I can, because I think it's so important. It shouldn't be in an ivory tower. It shouldn't be behind gates. The gates should be open, and we should welcome all in to think about a past, because the past is always there waiting for you. I find my students every day come up with topics. And indeed, the project I'm working on that I won a Guggenheim for was something that was introduced to me by a freshman in Belfast when I was teaching at Queen's University, asking me questions. So inquiring minds about the past can always uncover new paths, and I think be rich and rewarding. And the way in which people continue to emphasize employability and what are you going to do with that degree continues to be very disheartening to me, because I would always say when I was teaching over in Belfast, well, you could become the prime minister like Gordon Brown, or you could do other things, but everyone also needs to think of their own family, their own life, their own community. And Connecticut is very rich in that, in looking out into the community. And I had a great time taking my kids all over the state and introducing them to the rich history of the Constitution state.
Thank you so much. Okay, so our very last question, I just wanted to let you know, comes from Irene, who wants to thank you for this extraordinary wealth of information. I think everyone really enjoyed this evening. So Irene wanted to ask you, what do you feel would help you further your own research?
Well, I have to say that I began a project because I was very committed to the fact that in 2009, more American soldiers were losing their lives by their own hand than those involved in combat abroad in the war in which the United States military was engaged. And that struck me as such a very disastrous era that we are in now, that we don't understand what the toll of war is on soldiers. So I decided, I was trained by James M. McPherson at Princeton, a really amazing scholar, and that I would try and look at what some people have called, quote, the dark side of Civil War studies. But death and destruction and all of this is something that I feel is very important. So one of the things that I think would really help me with my work is to continue to believe that the work I'm doing on topics connected to the present will be appreciated and understood by wider audiences. And the only way to do that, of course, is to reach out to the public. I do have a new series at the University of Georgia called History in the Headlines. My first book was on Confederate statues and memorialization. We take a roundtable of scholars and have them discuss the issue, and then print it up with important articles and a bibliography so that average readers can find out about what is going on in the headlines where historians are being asked important questions. So staying connected to the present is something I very much like. And I have found that I have really enjoyed my book tour. I'm going to West Virginia, where a small college is reading Harriet Tubman, The Road to Freedom. How exciting to imagine young minds looking at Harriet Tubman. That it has been within my own lifetime that I can see the impact of some of my work is very exciting. So being invited to talk about women in the Civil War is something that keeps me going. Of course, a lot of people say that they really want to be giving up teaching and having full time to work on their manuscripts. Well, I gave up teaching for 15 years and spent it raising my children. And now I'm back in the trenches of teaching and very excited about it. I do look forward to that leave when I hope to finish my book, but then I will hope to get back out on the hustings and be back at New Canaan Public Library. So thank you, Irene, for that very kind question.
Thank you so much, Professor Clinton. It was such a privilege to have you here tonight. I know that everyone enjoyed it. I do want to let everyone know that tonight's event was recorded, and after a few days processing, it will be up on our YouTube channel. If you would like to read any of these books we've mentioned this evening, you can either call the library or you can go to newcanaanlibrary.org and place some of these great books on history on hold. So thank you so much, Professor Clinton, and I do hope we will be able to have you in person here at New Canaan Library sometime soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, and have a good night.